Injuries to the extremities rarely threaten a person's life at the scene of an accident. Nevertheless, the care of these injuries is of utmost importance. There is generally no hurry. On the other hand, a knowledge of reduction is necessary. A dislocated fracture which is twisted and angulated must be lined up. Correct reduction, alignment, together with the use of a splinting and traction device, may prevent the injury from becoming worse during initial care and transportation to the hospital. Thus, the risk of complications, which may be life-threatening and/or lengthen the time of healing, may be reduced. The reduction, alignment of a fracture which is severely dislocated cannot, for practical reasons, be practiced on an actually injured person. To learn and practice the care of dislocated fractures of the lower extremities, we have designed the LIS, the Leg Injury Simulator. The LIS is a half-body mannequin which has one fracture of the lower leg and one fracture of the thigh bone. Either fracture can be locked by an intramedullary rod which is pulled through the fracture. Here the lower leg fracture is locked. The thigh bone fracture is demonstrated when raising the leg. The thigh bone fracture is locked in a similar way. The LIS has a light and sound signal system which simulates the pain of a real fracture. The patient is pain-free when the fracture ends are pulled apart. In the LIS, the signal is interrupted by the traction over the fracture. It seems appropriate to start the care of the injured leg by putting the ankle sling on both the fractured and non-fractured legs. The sling may be slid gently around the ankle. Cross the velcros over the foot when the person wears an ordinary walking shoe or when the foot is naked. With a bigger boot, for instance a ski boot, it is best to put the velcros around the ankle. This fracture is angulated and shortened. The rotation is evident by the outward rotation of the foot. However, the bone ends are in contact. The LIS signals the pain by sound. One emergency assistant uses both hands to grip above the fracture and below the knee joint to give a stable and adaptive counter support during the reduction maneuver. The other assistant grips the ankle with one hand, the ankle sling with the other hand, and starts a gentle pull to correct the angulation. The amount of pull is indicated by the sound signal, which becomes silent when the bone ends of the LIS are disconnected. If the pull is insufficient, the sound is heard again. Traction is continued and the foot is then rotated to the correct position. If traction is reduced and the bone ends are pressed against each other, the injured person experiences pain, indicated by the LIS sound signal. Increasing the traction silences the signal. During continued traction, the knee joint is straightened. Now the assistant holding the knee can do the fixation. The Quick Splint mattress is brought under the leg, the lower end just past the foot. The mattress is wrapped around the leg and gently tightened by the velcros. The length of the traction splint is measured from the groin. The T-bar is extended to 15 to 20 centimeters beyond the foot. The traction splint is introduced between the legs so that the Y support of the upper end of the splint meets the sitting bone, which will give comfortable support for continued traction. Next, the assistants transfer the traction to the splint by attaching the ankle slings to the T-bar. In a similar way, the non-injured leg is given gentle traction to balance the traction of the fractured leg. Fixation is concluded by encircling the velcros from the splint side of the mattress to the splint. If the sound signal has been silent during the reduction and fixation of the traction device, you have succeeded in handling a dislocated fracture without causing the patient unnecessary pain. It is important that the angulation of the fracture is dealt with before starting to correct the malrotation, to avoid injury to the vessels in or adjacent to the fracture. The large arteries and veins follow one another and run alongside the tibia and fibula. A large vessel may thus be dislocated, caught, or even hooked by the fracture, the bony ends of which may be sharp as a knife. Twisting the angulated fracture could very easily injure a vessel. It is therefore of utmost importance that the angulation is corrected before dealing with distortion, to give the vessel a chance of being released from the trapping. Maintain the traction until it is taken over by the traction splint. The amount of traction needed is guided by the patient's pain. The force for lower leg fractures generally amounts to approximately 5% of body weight, that is, 2 to 4 kilograms. The thigh bone fracture is angulated and shortened. Rotation appears from the foot twisted outwardly. Note that the knee joint is bent. To control the fracture, the knee joint has to be straightened. One assistant grips above the knee with both hands. The other assistant grips the foot and ankle sling and moves the lower leg to get the knee joint straight. The assistant holding the foot now controls the leg below the fracture and may gently start to pull the leg distally from the fracture. By gradually increasing traction, and with the injured person's body as a counterweight, the angulation of the fracture can be overcome. Finally, the rotation is corrected by turning the foot to the right position. Decreasing the pull and letting the bone ends touch each other will initiate a sound signal from the LIS. The quick splint mattress is brought under the leg as near the groin as possible and is closed using the velcros. Avoid crossing the velcros to make it easier to attach the mattress to the splint. The length of the traction splint is measured from the groin, setting the T-bar 15 to 20 centimeters beyond the foot. The traction splint is placed between the legs, the Y support in firm contact with the sitting bone, which will give a comfortable counter support for the traction. The mattress is attached to the splint using the velcros from the splint side. Traction should be increased if the patient experiences pain, which the LIS will indicate by a sound signal. By setting the knee joint straight, you can control the leg below the fracture. It is important to correct angulation prior to the distortion to avoid injury to vessels near the fracture. The major arteries and veins run alongside the femoral bone. Twisting an angulated fracture could cause a large vessel to be hooked by the sharp bony ends of the fracture. Instead, this risk is minimized if the twisting is performed when the fracture has been aligned. The amount of traction needed to have a patient with a thigh bone fracture pain-free is generally about 10% of body weight. In the LIS, the tension over the fracture can be adjusted to 7 to 9 kilograms. Apply the ankle slings to both the injured and non-injured legs. It is preferred to start by aligning the more distally situated fracture, in this case the lower leg fracture. One assistant grips the knee with both hands to give support and counter the traction, which is carried out by the other assistant who grips the ankle sling and foot. When the lower leg fracture is aligned, the distortion of the foot may be corrected. The assistant holding the knee may now adjust his hands to just above the knee joint. The continued traction will make it possible to straighten the knee joint, and then to align the thigh bone fracture. Finally, distortion of the thigh bone fracture is corrected to allow splinting and traction using the quick splint. We have demonstrated the care of fractures to the lower leg and to the thigh bone using the leg injury simulator. We have shown examples of alignment and reduction of these fractures to enable the subsequent stabilization in the quick splint traction device. Using the LIS, every instructor may teach the care of dislocated fractures according to his or her experience and routine. Students may learn and practice the gripping and reduction maneuvers of fractures, which may be varied extensively in the LIS. The realistic fracture situations in the LIS dummy and repeated practice with team members will make it possible to develop the skillful collaboration needed when caring for severe fractures of injured persons. Professional care of fractures reduces suffering and the risk of complications, which in turn will aid a shorter healing time and the avoidance of permanent disability.